This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. June is Pride Month, and this year it's the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in Manhattan's Greenwich Village, when members of the LGBT community rebelled against police during a raid at the Stonewall Inn. That day in 1969 sparked the start of the gay liberation or gay rights movement, a movement that continues today for individuals seeking equality, no matter their sexual orientation or gender identity. Today, Where We Live, we're focusing on LGBTQ history in Connecticut. Did you know the longest continuously running LGBT radio program airs on the University of Hartford's radio station, WWUH? Coming up, we'll be joined by the host and producer of Gay Spirit Radio, Keith Brown. First, gay rights activism in Connecticut started before Stonewall. Joining us now with more is William J. Mann. He's an award-winning author and historian who was named the director of Central Connecticut State University's LGBT Center in 2018. And back in the 90s, he was co-publisher of Metroline, a former Hartford-based gay and lesbian news magazine. William's joining us via Skype. Thanks for joining us today, William.
It's great to be here.
In studio with us is Eve Galanis, a CCSU student who spent the past year working on a Connecticut LGBTQ history exhibit and digital timeline. It was a joint effort between the university and the Connecticut Historical Society. Eve, welcome to Where We Live.
Hi, welcome.
So I wanted to start with William, who was your professor at one point, Eve. William, before you became director again of the LGBT Center at the university, or since you've become director, you've been working with the Connecticut Historical Society and students like Eve about working on this timeline. So tell us what prompted the research project to begin.
Well, I have to give credit to the Connecticut Historical Society. It was their idea. Eileen Frank, who's the director, she came to me about a year ago and said, wouldn't it be great if we could actually put together a timeline of LGBT history in the state? And as it was happening, I was teaching a course that fall on public history. And so I turned the class into a research team, and we had an amazing semester of discovery. Every student did outstanding work. And with the collaboration with the Historical Society, we're able to tell some really important stories, unknown stories up until now, about LGBT people in Connecticut going back to the 17th century.
That's really fascinating that you were able to find information that far back. Eve Galanis, again, one of your students working on that project. So let's learn a little bit about some of what you uncovered. Eve, going back to the colonial times, what evidence was there of gay and lesbians in that time, in that era?
So back in around 1656, the Connecticut colony and the New Haven colony were split up, and they had their own colonial puritanical laws regulating people and their behavior. So what we found that was really striking specifically was the 1656 New Haven statute that regulated, it said, if any man lieth with mankind as a man lieth with a woman, both of them have committed abomination, and that they would be subjected to execution. But what's interesting about that law, more than any other sodomy law that you saw in the nation, was that it's also regulated women's autonomy too, and it explicitly had language in there to regulate men and women and their sexual expression and autonomy in the world. So you definitely see back in that time period more repressive laws regulating bodies. And what's also really interesting to note is that these sodomy laws weren't abolished until 1972 in Connecticut. So as archaic as they seem, they're obviously not really.
So it's good to get some of that context. Despite those laws, despite the punishment being death, if found to be in some type of same-sex relationship, you did find evidence, letters going back to the 1800s. Tell us about what you found.
Yeah, there were stories. I mean, obviously, despite a repressive society, there were people that found what we call romantic friendships, and their evidence is in their letter writing to one another. So one really striking story that our fellow historian Christina Volpe found. Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus were two African-American women living in Hartford and Farmington in the 1800s. And they had a very pointedly intimate relationship with one another that exceeded platonic dynamics. Now, can we explicitly say that they were lesbians? No, obviously, because back then we didn't have the same relationship with sexuality and gender as we do today. But we can say that they did have a very deep, profound relationship. And so Addie Brown, she wrote to Primus, she says, "What a pleasure it would be to address you, my husband." So clearly it was, more than just a simple friendship.
So you mentioned these letters. Where were they uncovered?
I believe they're at the Connecticut Historical Society archives, right, Dr. Mann?
That's right. That's right.
And that and Brigadier General Griffin Alexander Stedman, a decorated Union soldier from Hartford. He also exchanged letters with a man, Charles Jeremy Hoadley, and they also had a really intimate relationship. So, yeah.
William, you have quite a career as a writer. You've written about gay Hollywood. Tell us about the emerging gay culture that was coming to Connecticut in the arts and stage community. I understand actress Mae West debuted a play in Bridgeport with an all-gay cast.
Oh, that's right. And as Eve points out, that it's important not to overlay contemporary definitions onto these people. This was, the construct of being homosexual or a lesbian or transgender. It didn't exist yet. But at the same time, the evidence shows that these people existed, even if they wouldn't have thought of themselves in that way. And certainly the relationships existed. And what happened with Connecticut was that we were a bit, we weren't New York, we weren't Boston or Los Angeles or Chicago. So we had to wait in some ways for some of that more personally identifiable culture to come to us. And so we begin to see that in the 1920s and the 1930s. The Harlem Renaissance was taking place in New York, which was a flowering of African-American and largely LGBT culture. We see people like Countess Cullen coming into the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Absolutely, Mae West came to debut her play, The Drag, in Bridgeport, which had an all-gay cast, and West's stated intention was to uncover truths about people's lives. So this is the way Connecticut began to be exposed to this growing self-affirming identity of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender.
William Mann, again, is an award-winning author and historian, director of Central Connecticut State University's LGBT Center. Today, here on Where We Live, as we learn more about the LGBT history of our state. Eve Galanis is also here. She's a former student of Mann's, but also currently working on her history degree at the university. She helped with this research of the Connecticut LGBTQ history exhibit and digital timeline. We're going to have information coming up about where you can see this exhibit just a few minutes. But you mentioned the Wadsworth, William. Tell us more about Chick Austin and his role in bringing certain writers and artists to this region, including they even held a gala night.
Well, they certainly wouldn't have called it a gala night at the time, though, or if they did, the word didn't have the same connotation that it has today. But yes, Chick Austin was a risk-taking, very progressive artistic director at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, brought in a lot of ideas and voices that were being heard regularly in the larger cities, and in that way exposed Connecticut to a lot of these ideas. The night you're referring to was actually an opera written by Gertrude Stein, who was very undisguised about being a lesbian. She wrote a book called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which was Alice B. Toklas was her wife, which she called her wife. So the opera is written by Gertrude Stein. The music is by Virgil Thompson, who also was an undisguised gay man, and it's directed by Eva Jesse, who was a notable figure from the Harlem Renaissance, with an all-black cast. It's this incredibly queer, hysterically funny at times, very subversive take on sainthood. And it was hugely received. I mean, Hartford came out in droves to see this, and it got great reviews. And there it is at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, this incredibly queer performance by undisguised queer people, and that's 1934, I believe.
Eve, when you were doing your research along with other students, because of the beliefs at the time, because of the laws that were still in place, how difficult was it for this history to be uncovered?
One of the things that Dr. Mann told us basically in the beginning of the semester was that we were going to face some challenges because this history was designed to be hidden. It was not intended to be shown to the world. So it did take on an investigative quality to it. And there were times where, we had to rely on oral histories and people who actually were there and lived these experiences or knew somebody who lived or, had a family member that had experienced something. So sometimes we would have trouble getting in contact with people. I know from my research, because I was focused in the fall semester on mental health treatment of LGBTQ individuals. So I had my own challenges of being denied access to certain records. And so it did have some difficulties, more so than any other history I've ever researched. But it was all the more gratifying when you did find something.
What's really remarkable about the anecdote you told us, these love letters between these two African-American women, Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus, when we think about same-sex relationships, was it difficult to find any evidence? You were able to find these letters, but of people who weren't gay white men.
Oh, yeah. And we had an intention right from the beginning of basically going into this research with an intersectional framework, meaning that we were looking at converging and diverging identities and how power would interact with them. We made it a goal right from the beginning that we didn't want to just focus on the stories of, gay white men, but that is the dominant narrative, right? Mm-hmm. And so that also was a challenge to find diverse stories. But we did find some. Another challenge, I'd say, especially in particular with looking at gender nonconformity, non-binary, transgender, the further back you go, the more difficult it is to uncover. I remember we were asking for photos of, I forget which transgender organization in Connecticut, we asked them for photos, and they said, well, we don't have photos prior to 2000 because people were afraid to be photographed for their own safety. So that does pose a challenge in documenting the history.
Eve, you had mentioned doing research into the mental history of LGBTQ individuals. That was a downside for people who did come out, so to speak, because they were treated as having mental or personality disorders. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you were able to track some of those records down at some of the institutions that are still or facilities that are still in existence here in the state.
Yeah, so I specifically focused on the mid-20th century when sexuality and gender nonconformity was treated as a mental illness. So I initially focused on two institutions, the Institute of Living in Hartford and Connecticut Valley Hospital in Middletown, because they're some of the oldest hospitals in the nation. And so I figured that I would have a plethora of information. And I knew that I was going to have a challenge just from the fact that I was going to be denied medical records, and I knew that, and that's fine. But I didn't realize how much of a challenge it would be to find information from these organizations, these facilities. Institute of Living did meet with me. There was someone that did meet with me and have an interview, and they corroborated that people were treated there for quote-unquote sexual deviation, as they called it at the time, and that they were treated with medication, electroshock therapy, and sometimes lobotomies. I could not validate these with sources because I could not get access to their archives, which is on site. And at CVH, the challenge with them is that DMIS, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, doesn't have the funding to continue their historical preservation of CVH. And as well as understaffing at the hospital, I anticipated not getting in touch with anybody, and I didn't. So I was kind of left to my own devices, to which I went to the state library, and if they're listening, thank you. But they really helped. And so I looked at the governor's records and the Department of Mental Health records. In the Department of Mental Health, I found information that in 1956 in the state of Connecticut, any sexuality or gender nonconformity was classified as, again, sexual deviation, which was a personality disorder, and it was treated as such. I also found in that document they were talking explicitly about children and children that exhibited this kind of behavior and their conversion therapy treatment process, which included 24-hour one-to-one supervision for the child. And obviously we know as of 2017, that's been banned in Connecticut.
William, again, these are really interesting facts and stories that your students have been able to uncover through this project. When we think about the mental health treatment of some individuals during this time, were there people that you or other students were able to interview that maybe went through such treatment when their families found out that they may be gay or lesbian?
Absolutely, there were people who went through these experiences. I know in my own work, when I was doing my research into gay Hollywood, I interviewed many people who had been subjected to conversion therapies, even in what is considered now today to be torture. There was also during this period of time there was. As well as being institutionalized, people were losing their jobs. There was a purge of all gay employees of the State Department. There was a purge of the Army. So this is the 1950s. Eva was very, very wise to focus her research on the 1950s and the early 1960s, because this is the darkest period in LGBT history in many ways. This is the period where people were routinely fired, discriminated against, harassed, arrested, and institutionalized. So this was that's the darkest period. But of course, it comes right before the breaks in the 1960s.
Before we head to break, there is a story that I wanted to highlight from the Timeline Project. You'd mentioned the Army, William. There's individual Edward Spires of Norwalk.
Yes.
Eve, can you tell us what happened to him?
So after World War II, if the government found out that someone was homosexual serving in the military, they were given what were called blue discharges or dishonorable discharges because of being homosexual. So in 2017, at the age of 91, Edward Spires sued the federal government to have that dishonorable discharge changed, removed, revoked, so that he could have a military funeral once he had passed. I looked in last night. I was looking in to find out what's happened since, and I couldn't find anything. But I will say that the Yale Law School contributed to the case, and he won. So yeah, and Yale Law School is actually working with individuals that have experienced the same thing as Spires.
Grant, it's important to remember these moments in history. William, how do you talk to your students about context happening today, specifically under the Trump administration and their decisions of enlisted individuals who are transgender?
Yeah, what's so disturbing right now is that this is the first time in history where a group of people have been extended rights and then had them taken back. That's never happened before. Transgender service people were given the right to serve openly in the U.S. Military under President Obama, and now under the Trump administration, there are all sorts of attempts to roll those rights back. This is really the first time where rights have been extended and then taken away. It's really it's very disturbing, because we often think of history as being a series of progress. That the arc of justice, is long, but it does bend towards the arc of history. Does bend towards justice, and I want to believe that. But this is a dark period right now, and we have to be vigilant. We have to look at what's happening, and I think understanding history the way my students are able to do in the last year has given them a perspective on what is happening today, because what happened in the past could happen again.
Eve Galanis, again, it was a pleasure to learn a little bit of the extensive research that you've done.
Yeah,
we appreciate you coming in.
Oh, really quick, before I go, I want to mention that we are actually launching the CHS website, which will have the digital timeline. It'll be more comprehensive, and people around Connecticut can contribute their own personal stories to make this an ongoing process. So yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Well, good to hear it. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest, William Mann, who's a director of the CCSU LGBT Center, will stay with us as we continue to talk about the gay rights movement here in Connecticut. After the break, we're going to learn more about how the community worked to gain acceptance and equality in the state. Are you a member of the LGBTQ community? You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
They say, can they be that close? Just let me state for the record, we're giving love in a family dose. We are family. Hey.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about the LGBTQ community in Connecticut 50 years after the Stonewall riots in 1969. Now, just yesterday, it was announced a monument will be put up in Greenwich Village to commemorate early LGBT rights activists Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, two trans women of color who were leaders in what was then called the Gay Liberation Front. My guest today, via Skype, William Mann, award-winning author and historian, who was named the director of CCSU's LGBT Center in 2018. And then in the 90s, he was co-publisher of Metroline, a former Hartford-based gay and lesbian news magazine. And joining us now in studio is Keith Brown, who's a longtime producer and host of the Gay Spirit radio program on WWUH 91.3 FM. That's the University of Hartford's radio station. Keith, welcome to our show.
Yes, good morning.
And William's joining us via Skype today. Now, I understand, Keith, your show is America's longest continuously running LGBTQ radio show. You helped put Gay Spirit on the air back in 1980. Then you became host and producer in 1983. So how did it all start?
I am convinced that it's the longest continuously broadcast radio program of its kind. There should be another radio show on the West Coast, IMRU, on Pacifica Radio out of Los Angeles. That show, if I remember correctly, was founded in 1973, but was not continuous in broadcast. When Gay Spirit Radio began its broadcasts, Thanksgiving of 1980, those broadcasts have been continuous week by week on Thursday evenings ever since.
Well, congratulations. That's quite a feat. One of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show, besides to talk about Gay Spirit Radio, we wanted to know more about the history of the LGBTQ community. So often the attention is on Stonewall and after.
Yeah.
But you were actually part of an organization called the Kalos Society before Stonewall. Tell us about what is that?
Yes. Now, that was an organization that I partly founded in October of 1968 through the good graces of the Reverend Canon Clinton R. Jones, counselor to the sexual minorities. He was the resident counselor here in Hartford for the George W. Henry Foundation of New York City. And his counseling service to the sexual minorities was out of his office at Christ Church Cathedral, that beautiful old Gothic church on Main Street here in downtown Hartford.
And so, Kalos, what does that mean?
Yes, now, the long story about this. Yeah,
keep it short, Keith.
I named the organization.
Okay.
And it draws upon ancient Greek history. The word, it's an adjective in classical Greek. Or it could mean good, shining, as is a shining example, beautiful and noble. And this word was used on the Killick's Cup, a kind of trothing cup between gay male lovers in ancient Athens. It was a custom. Well, you know, it is said that that there two young men were like brothers. They were so close that they drank from the same cup. Well, there was a kind of trothing ritual, so we understand, where gay male lovers would pledge their troth using the Killick's drinking cup, and the name of the lover would be inscribed upon the cup with that word kalos after it. There are many examples of these porcelain drinking cups that survive.
So we understand what kalos means. Then you added Gay Liberation Front to the name. Tell us why in 1971.
Yeah. Well, the organization became radicalized. I was partly one of the people that helped radicalize the organization after 1969 and the Stonewall riots in New York City. Two of our firebrand members, Ken Ron and Ron Malvin, joined the organization later on. 1968 through 1969 or so, they came in on the organization a little later and became our two most active members.
So when you say organization, was this a social group, or you felt like it was you needed support? What was it like to be a gay man back then?
In October of 1968, it began as maybe a group therapy session for some of Canon Jones' gay counselees. One of the three founding members, Harry Williams, wanted it primarily as group therapy. The other guy, Ken Malvin, he thought of it more as a social group. I wanted it to be a political organization, and later on, it became radicalized through Ken and Ron's work, and then my colleague, who was associated with the Gay Liberation Front in New York City, he and I, we further radicalized the organization, and we got to alter the name to Kalos Society GLF, Kalos Society Gay Liberation Front of Hartford.
So tell us what some of the activities were that you were involved in. So after Stonewall, demonstrations, seeking equality, civil rights for the community. But even here in Hartford, there were some protests. I believe one outside the La Rosa Park West restaurant in Hartford.
Yeah, it was on Park Street in Hartford. In the Parkville neighborhood. It was a kind of women's bar, lesbian bar, but they had a strict dress code, and women were supposed to dress appropriately. I think they wanted to keep the butch lesbians out of the bar. The jack-booted butch lesbians that wore the bib overalls and that kind of thing, they were an embarrassment. But we say they needed to change the dress code and began to picket the place outside. I was in the picket line for one of several nights. The night after I was on, everybody got arrested.
So what happened after that protest? No more dress code?
No, we leaned upon the owner-manager of the place, and eventually she did change the dress code.
You're hearing, again, Keith Brown, who's a longtime producer and host of Gay Spirit Radio program on WWUH. It's 91.3 FM at the University of Hartford. We're learning more about the history of activism in the LGBTQ community here in our state. Joining us via Skype is William Mann, who is director of Central Connecticut State University's LGBT Center, and he was also co-publisher of Metroline, a former Hartford-based gay and lesbian news magazine for a period in the 90s. I was wondering, William, if you could talk about some of the other, from your project with the Connecticut Historical Society, some of the other activities the Kalos Society was involved in. I think there was one protest in Bridgeport that same year.
Yes, there was, and that's significant in that it was a protest against police brutality and police harassment of LGBT people. Listening to Keith speak, I'm struck again by how progressive Connecticut was. I mean, Kalos predates Stonewall. This was an organization that, it was founded as a social group or as a therapy group, but it quickly becomes political after Stonewall, and immediately starts these kind of actions. We don't see that in many other states around the country. Certainly not a state as small as Connecticut. So that's really significant, and it's a moment in history, as I tell my students, that before Stonewall, LGBT history is there. You just have to learn to read between the lines without reading into them. That's my advice to my students. Make sure you can read between the lines, because the history is there. It's just not written down explicitly, but you can't read into it either, because then you're reading into contemporary ideas and concepts. But after Stonewall, as Keith points out, gay life becomes radicalized, and we see these sorts of protests, whether they be in Hartford at a bar or at in Bridgeport at the police station, in the mayor's office. Stonewall changes everything.
It wasn't until the early 80s that Connecticut actually had its first gay pride rally. Keith, were you there?
Yeah, and I'm thinking that people wore masks
This was at the grounds of the old State House.
Yeah, to protect their identity, certain people wore masks.
And William, what can you tell us about that day and who went?
It was a group of people. I think there was a couple of hundred people, and you have to remember how brave these people are. Yes, many of them were wearing masks, and that's a practice that endured up until the late 1980s. I remember my first rallies; people were wearing masks. I was part of the Connecticut Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Civil Rights, and we actually passed out masks to people to wear, because you could lose your job. This wasn't simply, I don't want to be known as gay. You could lose your job. You could be arrested. You could lose your family. It was a real serious step to take if you were going to come out to a gay pride rally. And the fact that 200, 300 people did year after year after year, getting bigger all the time, really speaks to the need and the desire to claim authentic identities.
Today here on Where We Live, we're learning more about LGBTQ history in Connecticut. My guest, William Mann, who's director of the LGBT Center at Central Connecticut State University, joining us via Skype, and Keith Brown, who's a longtime producer and host of the Gay Spirit radio program on WWUH. William, you mentioned that Connecticut was still pretty progressive compared to other states at that time. There were efforts to pass a gay rights law before the General Assembly, and that had to come up time and time again. But then there was something that happened to a young man, Richard Ryle in Wethersfield. What happened to him in 1988?
He was murdered, and I remember this very vividly because I had just come out myself, and the story of Richard Ryle being murdered in Wethersfield by two teenagers from South Catholic High School, clearly a hate crime. The confession read that we realized he was queer, he had to die. It galvanized the state. There were no more masks after Richard Ryle's death. I remember some of those rallies right afterwards, candlelight vigils, and I remember people saying, maybe we should start with a prayer and bowing our heads. And Liz Toledo, who was an activist at the time, she looked at us and said, "I'm not bowing my head." And we all said, no more bowing our heads. We were angry. A man had died, and after he died, the initial response from the Catholic Church and from civic leaders was, well, these two boys that killed him, they were good boys. And, this was something that galvanized the state into, we see the Connecticut Anti-Violence Project form after this. And we had people at the trial, at the hearings for the killers. It was a moment, it was a turning point. And that was the point where more and more people came out, and from there, we begin to see things really beginning to change.
Keith, what do you remember about that time? William mentioning that the community was so galvanized, that people felt comfortable coming out in support and being their true self. You were someone who came out in the 60s, and so how did the climate change? How did you see it change?
Oh, I came out in high school, Newington High School in 1965, wearing the scarlet letter H, which was which was inspired by the scarlet letter A, Hester Prynne's Stigma, right from the famous novel.
Was it risky for you at the time to do that way?
It turned out not to be. No, I guess I could have been assaulted, but no, nobody ever bothered me about it. Wore it for about 3 weeks, made my point, and then went on to found a sexual liberation front with my GLF colleague, Ron Carrier, on the University of Hartford campus. That was about the time that I sought counseling from the George W. Henry Foundation, which led to the founding of Kalos Society.
Yeah. When you heard about what happened to Richard Ryle in 1988, tell us what went through your mind. I'd already seen or read about many instances of this prior to this. But the founder of Gay Spirit Radio, Rob Meehan, it was his policy not to cover sensational crimes of violence. And so Gay Spirit Radio did not cover the Ryle case. Of course, it was Bill Mann and Metroline magazine that took that up. And remember that the Richard Ryle murder case got a lot of publicity, a lot of coverage in the Hartford Courant. So Gay Spirit Radio didn't need to do that. Well, we were more interested in community organizing and community events and covered those things more intensively. Well, since you mentioned, again, William Mann, who's with us, who was the co-publisher of Metroline, you were covering this story, but you were also instrumental in helping change some minds as the state legislators were looking to whether or not they should pass a gay rights bill in 1991. What happened there?
Well, are you talking about the church?
Yes, with the church and changing some minds on some of the people lobbying against the bill.
I had a meeting with Father Tom Barry, who was the Archbishop's liaison or his publicity person, or I'm not sure exactly what his title was. And we sat down, and the church had been adamantly opposed to against the gay rights bill, or even at this point adding hate crimes legislation to include sexual orientation. And I remember meeting with Father Barry and saying to him, listen, I was brought up Catholic, and I'm looking at the church, and they're telling me that my life doesn't matter, that Richard Ryle's life doesn't matter, that that sexual orientation doesn't deserve to be included in hate crimes protections. And I'm not saying that I convinced him, but I think he saw it on a more personal level at that point. And there was kind of an opening, a dialogue that the Archbishop's office was able to then talk with the Connecticut Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Civil Rights and work out a plan by which, when the gay rights bill came up, the church didn't endorse it, but also no longer opposed it.
And that was in 1991 that then Governor Weicker signed that bill into law.
That's right.
After that happened, did we see lawmakers publicly coming out, William?
Well, actually, it happens before that. Actually, Joe Graybars, State Representative Joe Graybars from Bridgeport, comes out in the buildup for the gay rights bill, and his personal story has a huge impact on the legislature to say that, this is, we know a gay person and that he works among us. Right after that, Leslie Brett, who was the chairman for the Connecticut Human Rights Commission, she also comes out as a lesbian. And this is huge too, because she's somebody that everyone respects and has been working with them for years. Those two coming out stories greatly impact the passage of the bill. I should also add that part of the pressure was amped up by a group of 12 activists who disrupted then Governor O'Neill's speech because he absolutely refused to support the bill and said he would veto anything that was passed. And that disruption of his speech really left an impact. People said, well, these people mean business, and this is serious stuff. And the combination of all of those things is what led the bill to be passed.
William Mann, again, is a CCSU professor and head of its LGBT Center here on Where We Live with Keith Brown, longtime producer and host of the Gay Spirit radio program on WWUH 91.3 FM. We're going to hear a little of his theme song as we head into break, and we're going to talk more about the movement for rights for LGBTQ individuals in Connecticut. You can join us, too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
When we were born, they tried to cover our eyes. Then they tried to tell us all what to see. We are discovering that did not work, for we were born to be free. It's a gay spirit singing in our hearts, leading us through these troubled times. It's a gay spirit moving round this land, calling us to a time of open love. When we were born, they tried to put us all in a cage, then tell our bodies what to feel. We have chosen to feel all the truth that our bodies do reveal. The gay spirit singing in our hearts, leading us through these troubled times. It's a gay spirit moving round this land, calling us to a time of open love.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Keith Brown, longtime producer and host of the Gay Spirit Radio program on WWUH 91.3 FM, and William Mann, who's Central Connecticut State University's director of its LGBT Center. He's also a professor there. Keith, we'd be remiss not to mention, during all of these years of progress towards acceptance and equality, the community was also dealing with the AIDS crisis, and many prominent members of the gay community passing. You've interviewed some of them. Can you tell us about those individuals?
Yeah, it was a topic that we covered, certainly, through the 1980s and 1990s. Yeah, and so many people I knew from that era, unfortunately, now are deceased. Yeah, we need to give, before we go any further, credit to Richard Nelson for his timeline that preceded the one that's now on display at the Connecticut Historical Society. Yeah, I'm trying to think of names of people, AIDS activists that I had dealt with. Oh, there's Ken Brown, for instance, a local openly gay man and a professional singer, I believe. He was on. He had been on the air. He was with Act Up.
And Victor DeLugan, am I saying his name?
Yes, Victor DeLugan, yes, a professor of political science at University of Hartford, and a kind of mentor to Bill Mann.
Absolutely. He was one of my dearest friends and shaped my political view of the world, and my husband, Tim Huber's view of the world. And there was a period of time, as Keith says, that so many of them are gone. We lost an entire generation. So many people in the generation right above me are gone. There should be so many more gay men who there should be so many more of them, but they're gone. And so thank God we have Keith and others who tell us about those times, because it's a big gap in understanding history because we've lost so many people.
I think of it as our Holocaust.
Yes.
We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask again, with all of the progress that's been made, not only in Connecticut, but in other states around our country, there's still efforts to help with protections of transgender residents. Is this something that Connecticut needs to work on, or are we in a good place, William?
Well, I'm very proud that Connecticut passed the transgender rights law in 2011. And again, we were one of the first states to do that. It's insignificant that when the gay rights bill was passed, it did not include transgender people. So this was a bill that was needed to cover gender identity and gender expression. Transgender people right now are the ones on the front lines, and they're the ones being most targeted. So it is a concern, and is something we have to continue to look at, because trans lives need to be seen as valuable, and they need to be integrated into our culture, into our universities. Thankfully, at CCSU, our president has made it very clear that she values trans lives, and we've had several expressions of that. We had the Transgender Day of Remembrance last November. We'll do that again for those trans people who have been killed by anti-trans violence. It is the letter in the acronym LGBT that right now is getting the most focus, and we need to make sure that we are as supportive of that as we've been all of the other letters.
At the same time, again, many Pride celebrations throughout the month of June, not only in our state, but across the nation, in Canada, in the UK. But there are places around the world where it's still very dangerous to be out.
Don't be in Uganda. I can tell you that much.
Can more be done by Americans to help individuals who are in countries where they could face imprisonment or death, William?
Oh, absolutely. I think we need to lead by example, but we also need to look at our own country too. I mean, there are places in this country where LGBT people are still oppressed, and if we look at the rates of new AIDS infections, men who have sex with men in the South, particularly Black men, the rates are going up again. So we need to look at that. We need to look at even around the world, but also right here in our own country, that this has not been won by any stretch of the imagination. There are still challenges every day.
William J. Mannigan is award-winning author and historian, director of Central Connecticut State University's LGBT Center, former co-publisher of Metroland. This is a former Hartford-based gay and lesbian news magazine. Thank you so much for joining us via Skype today, William.
It's great to be here.
Again, we're going to have information on our website, wnpr.org/wherewelive, to that great history project that William Mann's students, in collaboration with Connecticut Historical Society, have been working on. And in studio with us is Keith Brown, longtime producer and host of the Gay Spirit radio program. I should mention it's on Thursdays at 8:30 p.m. at 91.3 if you want to hear Keith, again, America's longest continuously running LGBTQ radio program. Thanks so much, Keith, for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Scott Breedy. Thanks to Lydia Brown. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. And have a great weekend.